The parable of the wedding banquet, which is a continuation, as I mentioned the past several weeks, that we're going to be spending time in Matthew 21 through chapter 24, focusing on that time where Jesus finds himself in the temple and he's teaching in the temple. He's teaching to the crowds that are gathered there, the disciples who are following him, and also to all of those people that are gathered there for the scribes and Pharisees and the high priests and those people. So you've got this elite group who think they've got it all figured out. And then you've got those who are coming in because they're caught up into this good news message that Jesus has to bring. And there they are gathered together in the temple, and Jesus is sharing in these stories and parables. Some of you might be familiar with the parable of the wedding banquet. Some of you might be new to this parable, and so we'll kind of break it down for you today. But as we talk and celebrate and speak about the parable today, I just want to start at a different place. I want to start at the beginning. I actually want to start at the end. You know what happens at the end of the parable, right? The king has invited, yes, they don't show up. He's upset with them. He actually sends his armies to destroy them, so he opens the doors to everybody. Everybody shows up. What's interesting in the text is that he invites not just a few people, he invites both the evil and the good. Don't you think that's interesting? In other words, this offering of God's welcome and grace is wide open. And so everybody comes, but when they gather together and the king shows up, there's one person there who's not wearing the right garments, right? He's not wearing the right wedding clothes. And so the king has his hands bound and thrown out into the other darkness. It's pretty crazy, isn't it? Yeah. So I want to start there with this idea of what to wear at a wedding. I mean, it seems like that's pretty important in the text. Matter of fact, some of you might have been thinking to yourself when you were reading the parable, well, if you're thrown out because you're wearing the wrong wedding garment, what does that garment look like? What should you be wearing? Which got me thinking about a TV show that I actually like a lot, which is What Not to Wear. I don't know, anybody ever watch What Not to Wear? Yeah, I got caught up in What Not to Wear, and I know some of you are looking at me, you're thinking big, burly guy, it's hairy and all this kind of stuff. Seems like a little bit too masculine for that kind of show. I love those shows. I actually started watching What Not to Wear as a result of watching Project Runway, which I still watch to this day. That's a Thursday night standard at the Terry household, let me tell you. And the reason I got connected with Project Runway is because I grew up in a household of women, and my daughter, when she was in high school, used to watch Project Runway. And to spend a little time with her, I found myself watching Project Runway. And I'm just artsy enough, and I'm extremely bright-brained, that I find that show really interesting. They put the garments together. And then we were watching that show, and then my daughter would be watching shows after school, and I'd say, what are you watching? She'd go, I'm watching What Not to Wear. And I said, well, what's that show about? And she says, they send in these fashionistas into these people who are desperate because they don't know what to wear. They need to upgrade their wardrobe. So I started watching the show. You all didn't watch that show? A couple of you, right? Good, then I'm going to bring something new to you today. The reason that show speaks to me is it reminds me of this parable. Is that what happens in the show is that somebody, a family member or a friend or a coworker, sends a letter to this show asking them to send these fashion people to help their friend or their relative out because they're desperate. The letters include things like, please help Bob out because he hasn't changed his wardrobe since high school. I wasn't speaking about you, Bob, but it might be true. I don't know. Now, some of you might find it interesting that I am interested in What Not to Wear since I have a relatively boring wardrobe. I tend to wear the same things over and over and over again. I feel comfortable in these things, people. Blue jeans and t-shirts tend to be my wardrobe. I actually went to a district committee on ordained ministry meeting this week, and I said, forget it, I'm not wearing a collared shirt. So I came in a t-shirt. I walked in, and they said, only you, Roy. My wife, while watching the show, has turned to me frequently and said, boy, we really need to send a letter in for you. When I was in college, because I'm red-green colorblind, I could never match things, so I'd find myself sometimes out on the football field playing for my fraternity wearing purple, green, and gold, and red, white, and blue pants. You know, you stand out in the crowd when you do that. But I got to thinking about what not to wear, and within that whole show, you just find people that are stuck in a rut. They just can't move away from the past. Either they are still in high school and they're still wearing the clothes that they wore in high school even though they're 50, or they have a low self-esteem, a low body image, and so they're trying to cover up the imperfections that they see in themselves, and so they buy clothes that don't fit them properly. And so these fashion designers come in and they immediately go to their wardrobe and they start throwing stuff out. And that's usually where the greatest moment of tension exists. You can't throw out my leopard skirt. I've been wearing that since I was 16, right? You can't throw out my leather jacket. That's my favorite leather jacket. And they get in these arguments. They allow them to hold on to a few items that might still work, but the rest of it all goes to Goodwill. But not to wear. It's kind of the concluding point of this parable, isn't it? What not to wear when you come to the wedding feast. Now, the parable is an interesting story in and of itself. And if you read the parable in Matthew, the wedding feast of Matthew, it might raise some questions. I mean, there's only one other place that this parable appears amongst all the four Gospels. Do you all know the other Gospel that this story appears in? No, that's why you pay me? Yeah. Okay, to tell you? Okay. It's in the Gospel of Luke. Both Luke and Matthew are telling this parable, sharing this parable that Jesus has taught. But both of them are speaking to very different audiences. I actually like the parable in the Gospel of Luke a lot better than I do the parable in Matthew. Because the parable in Matthew is just so darn violent. In Luke's version, which Luke, by the way, is speaking to a predominantly Gentile audience. This is the community that the Jews don't necessarily want to be invited in. And so in Luke's parable, when he tells the story of the wedding feast, the king comes, he invites all of his friends, the friends don't show up, so he sends the servants out to invite whoever they meet, and sure enough, everybody shows up. And you still have at the end of the parable this person in the wrong wedding garment, and they're thrown out. In Matthew's gospel, they're very different, right? He goes and he invites everybody to the wedding feast. The friends don't show up, so he sends another servant to invite them again. And what do they do to the servants? They beat them. They turn their backs on them. And then a few of them kill the servants. And the king is so enraged, what does the king do? He sends his army in to wipe them out. And not only wipe them out, but burn their city to the ground. Wow, isn't that exciting? Doesn't that sound like the king you want to follow? Actually, when you read that text, you think, man, how violent is this? Let's go back to Luke. Luke's a lot easier for us to receive and grasp, but you got to remember, people, you got to read it through the eyes of the author. Matthew is writing to a very different audience than Luke. And who is Matthew writing to? He's writing to a predominantly Jewish audience. Now, a lot of these texts that we're reflecting on through these next few weeks, actually last week we talked about the wicked servants, the wicked tenants. And when I emphasized that text was used and abused by Nazi Germany. These texts have been used throughout the ages by anti-Semites all over the world to justify their actions and their violence towards the Jews. What they don't remember, though, is that the Gospels and the stories of Jesus are written and shared by Jews. Jesus is he's a Christian, right? No, he's a Jew. He's a Jew. Matthew and Luke are both Jewish.
When you read the Gospel of Matthew and you realize that Matthew is writing to a predominantly Jewish audience, you have to remember that Matthew is writing to his own people. And so when you're reading that parable, you have to realize that he's making connections with their story, the story that he's a part of too. And so when you read his great feast, his great wedding banquet story, he's reminding Israel of the atrocities of their past. Not necessarily God's past, but their past. Think about it in the Old Testament. Who did God send to communicate the good news of God's work and love in the world in the Old Testament? The prophets. The prophets. And what did Israel do to the prophets? Killed most of them, right? They weren't a very popular bunch. And what happened to Israel after finally the kingdom came to its conclusion? The armies of Assyria and Babylon came and sacked Israel and took them away into exile. Jew is speaking to Jew. Israeli is speaking to Israeli, reminding them of their own response to God's message of good news. Matthew's reminding them that they've turned their back on God. God hasn't turned God's back on them. And the consequences of their actions have led to the violence that they've experienced. But God's kingdom is breaking through. And God is offering a new opportunity through his feast of grace. That's the community that Matthew's talking about. And Luke's gospel is very different. He's speaking to the Gentiles. What do the Gentiles need to hear about this good news? They need to hear that they're all welcome in. That nobody's excluded, right? They need to know that while they've been kept out, God's grace is made available for all. And so all are welcome to the banquet. All are welcome to let their walls and their barriers come tumbling down. How many times do we say that in Cornerstone? That they might enter into a relationship with God, with each other, with themselves, and with God's creation, to be able to become a part of the new creation work in the midst of the world. And to be made aware that when we create allegiances, when we create us first them scenarios, when we totally allow our lives to dive into our own ideologies and set ourselves against the other, that's what creates the tension, the division, and the separation. God's grace is unfolding in this world. The party is available for all who will come and receive it. Praise be to God, huh? Praise be to God. I mean, that's a good message of hope, isn't it? Oh, yeah. And so in Matthew's gospel, when he's speaking to a predominantly Jewish audience, he's reminding them that this message of good news that is now made available through Jesus Christ, this invitation is not limited to anybody, but open to everybody. And I love the line in Matthew says, evil and good alike. Who's welcome to the table? Is everyone welcome to the table? Only good people welcome to the table? And all the rest of you need to leave, right? Evil and good, welcome to the table, because God's grace is sufficient for all of us. This is the garment of the new creation. The garments of the new creation are defined by things like forgiveness, reconciliation, peace work, hospitality, unconditional love. Those are the garments of the new creation. They're not bound by labels or system. What not to wear are the things that are still in your closet. The old things that you're comfortable with. The things that have given you an identity to exist in the midst of the world, even though those identities find themselves broken and futile. You don't believe me? Think about your own life. I'm thinking about mine this week. Think about your growth. Think about the time you finally arrived at high school, right?
You all remember the high school you went to? Some of you might be forgetting by now. I don't know. You remember high school? You remember your mascot? Yeah. On the count of 3, we're all going to shout out our mascot. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Golden Eagles! Golden Eagles. That's right. See, I got the last word in. I mean, that's what the world is built in, right? Is this idea that we need to create identities and us versus them scenarios in order to be able to thrive and find security. I found security in being a Naples High Golden Eagle, and you know what? To this day, I still can't stand Baron Collier. I just can't stand it. Golden Eagle, man. I had the NHS shirt. I mean, I was a football player, and so I wear all the football stuff, my number. I still have my letter jacket hanging up in my closet. Right? I put it on occasionally. It's a little tight. It just reminds me of the good old days. You know, those ideologies, those allegiances. But then you get to be a senior in high school. What happens when you get to be a senior? You're like, Dylan, what do you think? That was all good for a moment, right? Now you're ready to move on to the next thing, right? And so you go to college. What did I do at college? Fraternity. Lambda Chi Alpha. Purple, green, and gold, baby. And I wore the letters, and I had Lambda Chi shirts, and I put Lambda Chi Alpha stickers on my car, and I drove around. I was really important because I was a Greek dude. I found my identity in that. Then you got to be a senior in college, you're like, that was fun. I have no regrets in my fraternity life, don't get me wrong, but you get to a point where you're like, oh, that's really not that important. That really isn't the thing that should be defining me. Have you all been there? In some way or another? What all those things did, though, was create us versus them scenarios. I don't like Baron Collier. As a Lambda Chi, I don't like Sigma Chi's. It goes on and on and on and on. The person wearing the wrong wedding garments are still wearing their letters. Did you hear me? The good news of the kingdom is we no longer need any labels. When we start working on that, we start realizing that everyone in the world, even those we might categorize our enemies, are still human beings and not objects of our aggression. When we start allowing ourselves to step into the fullness of the good news of the kingdom of God, as opposed to the kingdoms of the world, the walls and the barriers start coming down. And to quote my good friend Bono of U2, we hang out all the time. There's only us. There's only us. The garments that don't fit at the wedding banquet of the kingdom are those that still want to create the tribes and the divisions and the us versus them. May we truly seek in our own lives to identify those places, those garments that we're still holding on to in our closet. May the Holy Spirit, the great fashion designer of God, get rid of all those things, that we might find the garments and wear the garments that welcome all. To the glory of God, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.